Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Claudia Yagubi. I'm Roshan Institute Distinguished Professor of Persian Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm the President-elect of the Association for Iranian Studies. It's an honor to be here today and to moderate this panel. Before I begin, I want to briefly situate myself in this conversation. I was born and raised in Tehran, received my BA and MA in Iran, and spent more than a decade as a tenured faculty member teaching in Iranian universities before immigrating to the United States in 2006. I was also a child during the Iran-Iraq War, and I grew up with the reality of war shaping everyday life, the fear of bombings, displacements, and the understanding that conflict reaches far beyond the battlefield and enters homes, schools, and universities. Universities, therefore, for me, are not abstract institutions. They are living communities where I learned, taught, argued, questioned, and grew. They are also where I came to understand both the possibilities and the fragility of intellectual life under political pressure. This is why this conversation is deeply personal as well as professional. We are meeting at a moment when universities in Iran, spaces that should be dedicated to learning, inquiry, and the exchange of ideas, are under attack in multiple ways. In times of war, campuses can become targets of direct violence. Classrooms and libraries can be damaged or destroyed. Students and faculty can be displaced, and education itself can be interrupted. At the same time, universities in Iran have long existed under intense political scrutiny, where intellectual freedom is monitored and dissent is often treated as a threat. We saw this clearly during the 2022 Zan Zendegi Azadi Woman Life Freedom Movement. After the killing of Mahsa Jina Amini, universities became major centers of protest and resistance. Campuses across Iran, from Tehran to Shiraz and Tabriz, became places where students gathered, organized, and openly challenged repression. The response was swift and severe. Hundreds of students were arrested, suspended, expelled, or imprisoned. Universities once again became spaces of surveillance and punishment rather than protection and learning. This pattern continues today. January 2026 protesters, including young people and students, have faced prison sentences and executions. These recent reports of executions tied to political dissent remind us that the threat against students, faculty, and young intellectuals remains immediate and real. This is not accidental. Universities have never been neutral spaces. Historically, they have often stood at the center of political critique and social transformation. They are places where dominant narratives are questioned, where injustice is named, and where alternative futures are imagined. And precisely because of this, they are often subjected to censorship, surveillance, disciplinary actions, arrests, and direct violence. Let us be clear. Neither the destruction of universities through war nor the repression through state control is inevitable or acceptable. Whether through bombs from above and foreign aggression or repression from within, the result is similar: an assault on human life, knowledge, and the future. War destroys the physical foundation of education, while repression erodes the freedom necessary for thought, research, and public debate. Both leave lasting damage that extends far beyond the campus itself. And yet, even under these conditions, we continue to witness extraordinary courage. Students continue to demand their right to learn and to think freely. Faculty and staff work to preserve academic life, often under immense personal risk. This resilience is powerful, but it should not be required. Universities should not have to survive war or repression to fulfill their mission. As we begin this panel, we do so with a shared responsibility not only to analyze, but to speak clearly. Violence against universities, whether military, political, or institutional, is incompatible with the mission of higher education. The weakening of educational institutions is not only a national tragedy, but a global loss. So today we will ask, what happens when universities are no longer protected spaces? What are the immediate and long-term consequences for students, scholars, and knowledge itself? What protections exist and why are they failing? And what role can we, as an international academic community, play in resisting this normalization of violence? These are urgent questions because universities are not only about the present, but also about the future. A future built amid ruins of education, whether through war or repression, is inevitably a diminished one. Thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to this conversation with our first speaker, Dr. Mina Khanlarzade. Dr. Khanlarzade is an Iranian historian whose work focuses on modern Middle Eastern intellectual and cultural history, especially in Iran. She studies gender, sexuality, nationalism, translation, and postcolonial theory with particular attention to how ideas of modernity and the West shaped Iranian political thought. She earned her PhD from Columbia University and later held several postdoctoral positions, including one at Northwestern University. She is currently a faculty member at Deep Springs College. One of her major research projects explores how Iranian intellectuals before and after the 1979 revolution redefined ideas of nation, gender, and westernization, especially through cultural figures like the dandy and the revolutionary subject. Her work combines history, literary studies, and critical theory, making her known for a deeply interdisciplinary approach. Dr. Khanlarzade, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction and for bringing us together for this very important conversation. And I'm also very grateful to be part of this panel and to be able, to collectively think about what's happening to universities in Iran. And I'm going to share my slides. Okay.
I expect that is essential.
Sorry about that. Okay, so in March and April of 2026, campuses in Iran were bombed. And also since 2007, scientists have been assassinated. So these attacks must be condemned, obviously, and of course, but this talk asks a question: what does it mean to defend the universities that were bombed? So before the March and April of 2026 bombing of campuses, Iranian scientific life was already under pressure. Sanctions restricted academic exchange, access to equipment and research, and sometimes publication itself. This now extends to AI as well, because Iranian researchers are not fully cut off, but their access to major tools, including advanced chips and payment platforms and collaborations, is precarious and unequal. Since 2007, also besides the sanctions, since 2007, Iranian scientists, engineers, and university-affiliated experts have been assassinated through car bombs, motorcycle bombs, shootings, and airstrikes. These assassinations are widely understood to be linked to Mossad. After the assassination of Mustafa Ahmadi Roshan in 2012, CNN reported that an IDF spokesman wrote, "I have no idea who targeted the Iranian scientists, but I certainly don't shed a tear." In June 2025, during the 12-day war, several nuclear scientists and university-affiliated experts were killed in Israeli strikes, including figures connected to Shahid Beheshti University. More recently, Hossein Zaki Dizaji, a nuclear engineer and professor, was also killed. A state media called him Shahid Hastei, a nuclear martyr, and reported that he was killed alongside his daughter and mother-in-law. So before campuses were bombed, Iranian scientific life had already been shaped by isolation due to sanctions and fear of assassination, and also the securitization of scientific work. So this is where the war on Iran's universities began. So I mentioned the securitization of scientific work. By that, I mean that certain scientists who work on research related to nuclear or defense, they have to have bodyguards, for instance, and the science itself has turned into a battlefield. So in the most recent attack, the attacks shifted from individual scientists to educational institutions. And it should also be mentioned, even though it's not a university, but it's still, we need to mention the fact that a school in Mina was struck with devastating student casualties. And according to Iran's Ministry of Science, 30 universities have been directly struck, including Sharif University of Technology, Shahid Beheshti University, Iran University of Science and Technology, among others. The targets were research centers, labs, and science and engineering facilities, including Shahid Beheshti's Laser and Plasma Research Institute, and AI research infrastructure at Sharif University. So it's not only physical destruction, it's also the weakening of institutional life that makes science possible. That's the result of these targets and these attacks. So many Iranians experience this, besides the exclusion from a global academic life due to sanctions, they experience this as a collective punishment. If one main rhetoric around the attacks has been Iran should be pushed back to a Stone Age, Iranian officials and commentators have reversed the phrase. The attacks themselves are described as belonging to the Stone Age because they are seen as anti-science, anti-rationality, and outside international law. It has also helped to pull universities closer to state narratives of permanent external threat and allows the Islamic Republic, despite its own regional ambitions and proxy wars, to present itself as an anti-colonial resistance force. So at the very moment when universities need a space to question state repression, particularly after the January massacre, and nuclear policy, given the huge cost Iran has paid for the nuclear policies, and scientific priorities, and also all of this in relation to foreign policy and politics in general, the attacks make the distance harder to sustain. What I mean by that is that it's very hard for universities to sustain that distance from the state to be able to play that role. And this is not just because of the state repression, it's because of these attacks. They make it very hard to sustain that distance. So in this document that is from Parsine News, the document was found in the rubble of Sharif University after the strikes. It is a great sheet for a quantum field theory class, one of the most advanced areas of theoretical physics. And this actually shows us that the destruction is not just the destruction of buildings, it's the destruction of life itself on the campuses. And here, the cover of Payam newspaper shows the bombing of Sharif University as an attack on Iran's scientific capacity and also a site of national mourning. So the university itself represents and becomes the site of national mourning. So the subheading specifies which departments were hit. It includes mathematics and computer science and the philosophy of science. The department that exists to ask what science foundations are, and what its relationship to society should be, it was struck. And it doesn't make much sense, because if we go with the logic that the places on campuses were attacked, that they are somehow connected to defense or nuclear activities, it doesn't really add up. As we know, many places were attacked that they do not have a direct tie to those areas. And even if they have direct tie to those areas, of course, their attack and their bombing is unacceptable. But it's important to notice that the destruction goes beyond that logic. And it's not only the destruction of scientific capacity, but it's also the destruction of the capacity to reflect on science itself. And what is important is that that's also a target of a state repression in Iran. So in this, here you see Sharif professor and physicist Farhad Ardalan. I let you listen to the video and then I discuss it.
I expect it's an existential land war with Israel. Now it is just air war. So for that, we need to organize ourselves. We have to have an advanced military. We have to have an advanced industry. If Israelis know this, they want to prevent it. So this war was about prevention. Destroying the industry in Iran, destroying the state structure, if possible, destroying the state itself to tear apart Iran into various pieces, and especially the modern military. Everybody knows that the future wars will be based on AI, and this, in fact, drones, which we see are very important, already are a significant part of the military. This place, they were doing AI. Chat, GTP, etc. All these things, you know, AI. So it's not of any military use now. But in 20 years, that I predict existential war with Iran and Israel, this will be very important. So they came and hit it. And they have done a similar thing with other universities. If they thought that there was a place which helped the development of Iranian industry and science, they would hit it.
So, as you heard in the video, Ardalan argues that to defend against Israel, Iran needs science, which leads to military power. Israel attacks because it fears that capacity. Therefore, we need to make the tie between university and military stronger. So notice that what is disappearing here. So understandable, but then at the same time is also happening, that this disappearance is happening. What is disappearing here is what are Iran's nuclear activities for? That's actually one of the questions. Or what has society had? Why has society had no role in decisions about such costly activities? What has been the cost? That can be also one of the questions. So Israeli official discourse says Iranian universities serve the military, so destroy them. A state-aligned nationalism says universities serve the military, so expand them. So the premise is identical. In both cases, the university is absorbed into a state military logic, and the result is the same. The inability to imagine the university as a space of open-ended inquiry and accountable to society rather than to the state. And these are the limitations that we are facing. So I want to step back briefly for the historical context. Critics of science's entanglement with militarism have a long tradition in Iranian intellectual history. Ahmad Kasravi in 1941, which is after the World War II, in the midst of the World War II, actually, called for science to be separated from war, militarism, and capitalism. In the 60s, Ahmad warned against the hydrogen bomb and argued that technology should serve social emancipation, particularly socialism. He wanted a technologically advanced society at the service of socialism. Ali Shariati in the 70s proposed integrating the humanities and sciences in the service of justice. Though that raised its own danger, who defines justice and who controls the knowledge that serves it? But if we disregard such complexities, the point is that these discussions existed in the intellectual history of the time, how to detangle and delink science from militarism and from capitalism, and how to think about what constitutes ethical scientific research and so on. I have discussed this in my recent paper that is titled Epistemic Translation of Modernity. So these critics were never fully institutionalized inside the university before the 1979. So it was very interesting for me when I was conducting oral histories for the Sharif University project. It was a collaborative project with two other researchers. When I was conducting the oral histories, I would oftentimes ask the interviewees if they had heard about these critics, because some of these interviews were very political. They were politically very active on the campus and outside the campus, but they had not even heard about these critics. So this the distance between the campus and the critics of intellectuals even existed before the 1979 revolution. But after the 1979, they were either discredited as ancestors of the Islamic Republic, so Shariati or Ahmad or even Kasravi himself, and so many of these are seen as ancestors of Islamic Republic intellectually, or dismissed as nativist and anti-modern. So this has led to a sense of dispossession, that we are dispossessed from our own intellectual history and our own tradition of questioning and critiquing. This is not to just accept what they have said, but it's to engage with it and try to see how to compare our contemporary concerns with the concerns that they had altered in the past. But we have lost that. We are dispossessed from those traditions. So the university being bombed today was already constrained and cut off from intellectual traditions, as well as the repression that is ongoing. And yeah, so these traditions could actually help us ask questions needed to protect both the university as well as the society from state policies that have kept both the campuses as well as the society in a permanent state of crisis, in a state of permanent crisis. So one consequence of the decades of conflict between Iran and US and Israel is that the same fields bombed as military capacity are also policed from within as zones of espionage and suspicion. So I give several examples of recent execution of engineers. Irfan Shakurzadeh was a 29-year-old aerospace engineer was executed in May 2026 after a month of torture and solitary confinement and forced confession. Ehsan Afrashte, a civil engineer graduate, was executed days later. Ruzbeh Wadi and Jawad Naimi, both nuclear engineers, were executed in 2025. Ali Younesi and Amir Hossein Moradi are two Sharif University students, have spent years in prison. They rejected the state pardon in protest against the recent executions. They just did that recently. So scientists and students are caught between two state machineries. One bombs them as military assets, or bombs their campuses and sees them as military assets or threats, and the other represses them as security risks. So in both cases, the university disappears as a university, as a place of asking questions and so on. And it's also important to note that these executions, they did not really have a trial that makes it clear what what the state had against them. Like we don't really know even the narrative around these executions very well. So the question is, what does it mean to defend Iran's universities? So defending Iranian universities must begin with condemning the attacks on campuses, scientists, students, and research centers. That's first and foremost. It also requires opposing the sanctions and restrictions that isolate Iranian academics from global scientific life. The fact that research may have military uses cannot justify bombing universities. As we know, many universities and STEM campuses have ties to military all over the world. And so we have to defend that just having military use cannot justify bombing universities or labs or scientific communities. Nor can defense mean silence about the Islamic Republic's securitization of knowledge and execution on espionage charges, forced confessions, and imprisonment, and repression of campuses. So a real defense must protect the university from external military destruction, external isolation, as well as internal security state violence. It must also defend the university as a space of critical public questioning, a place where society can ask what science is for, what it costs, and who decides, and how science, including in relation to politics, can remain accountable and ethical. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khanlarzade. So our next speaker is Dr. Ali Banuazizi, who doesn't really need my introduction. But for public audience who don't know Dr. Banuazizi, he's a research professor of political science at Boston College and affiliated faculty at the Center for International Studies at MIT. After receiving his PhD from Yale University in 1968, he taught at Yale and at the University of Southern California before joining the Boston College faculty in 1971. Since then, he has held visiting appointments at the University of Tehran, Princeton, Hebrew University, Harvard, Oxford University, and MIT. He served as the founding editor of the Journal of Iranian Studies from 1968 to 1982. He is a past president of the Association for Iranian Studies, as well as the Middle East Studies Association. He was also associate editor of the Encyclopedia of Islam and the Muslim World and the editor of Freedom of Thought Journal. Dr. Banuazizi is also the author of numerous articles on society, culture, and politics of Iran and the Middle East, and co-author of the book Social Classes, the State and Revolution in Iran, and co-editor of 3 books on politics, religion, and society in Southwest and Central Asia. Dr. Banuazizi, thank you for joining us today.
Many, many thanks for your generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be with this panel, and I want to begin by thanking Dr. Yacoubi for organizing the panel and the president and council of the Association for Iranian Studies for planning and carrying out these discussions. And let me take this opportunity to really offer a word of praise for our association for organizing, allowing these kinds of free discussions of the very critical issues that we are facing as students of Iranian studies and as Iranians in diaspora. I would contrast the approach of the AIS with taking political positions officially by the association. And that is really a very important issue to be mindful of. We certainly have, as students, as scholars, we have the obligation to address the issues as we are doing in this panel. But at the same time, it's important that our association would not become a political organization. That's somewhat different. Declaring a position on the issues or declaring boycotts against this country or another. And here I want to sort of rely on my own experience for the past almost 60 years that, when we established the Association for Iranian Studies, we were very much mindful of this, that a professional scholarly association should certainly be committed to the defense of the freedom of scholarship of students, of faculty, and so on and so forth. But it is not our position or responsibility to act as a political organization. And I would say that that idea and that commitment, that principle, is what has kept our association to continue for the past 6 decades. We went through the Iranian Revolution, for example, as an association, and it was very difficult. Many of us were very much involved. We were panjo hafti, so to speak. But we were careful not to involve the association directly in those conflicts and debates. So I'm very much in appreciation of the position of our association. As far as the focus of our discussion, the attacks on Iranian universities, without any hesitation and unequivocally, of course, I condemn the attacks. And there is not really much more that I could say, or really anything more than I could say, as what very eloquently Dr. Khanlarzade just described for us in her presentation. So by all means, I and almost all of the scholars that I know condemn the attacks on Iranian universities as a violation of human rights, violation of international law, and decency in approaching these conflicts. Let me maybe say a few words about the role of the universities and students in Iran. As I think most of you and certainly our audience, they know, the Iranian students have been very much involved in criticizing, in taking oppositional positions to the established powers. You know, one can think of the 16th of Azar back in the early 1960s, where students, stood up, and I believe 2 or 3 of them were actually killed in those years. And it has continued in the post 1979 revolution. Clearly, the university's students have played a key role as critics of the Iranian regime, upholding fundamental values of democracy, of independence, and so on. And with every one of the protest movements, as I think Dr. Khanlarzade alluded to, they have been very much involved, and they are today. So my point here is that our condemnation of the Israeli and American attacks on the universities, which we unequivocally condemn, should not let us to ignore what the Iranian regime, at this time the Islamic Republic, has done to the universities. It began with the Cultural Revolution, and it has continued by forced retirements, by arrests of faculty members, discharging faculty members without any kind of normal, hearing, any kind of judicial process, and so on. So we do have a very serious problem, not only by these attacks from abroad, but also by the repressive attitudes that the Islamic Republic has adopted towards the universities. So what can we do? I think these discussions, taking clear positions, critical of these attacks, is the first step. Connecting with our colleagues in Iran is very important. We should, try to kind of break down this wall between diaspora and the Iranians inside the country. I really think that is becoming a kind of artificial cleavage. We are all Iranians, and many of us are feeling that sense of depression as we witness the events, very much like the people in Iran are feeling it. So let's not draw that distinction, and let's make every effort to connect with our Iranian colleagues, to hear their positions, and to be of assistance in any way that we can. Perhaps I can stop here and maybe join the discussion as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Banuazizi, for sharing your invaluable experience as well as knowledge. So our next speaker is Mr. Kourosh Ziabari, who's a journalist and media studies researcher based in New York. a contributor to New Lines magazine and foreign policy. He is an alumnus of the East-West Center Senior Journalist Seminar Fellowship and a 2022 World Press Institute Fellow with the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota. Mr. Ziabari has covered the United Nations on Dag Hammarskjöld Fund for Journalists Fellowship. He has earned a master's in political journalism from Columbia Journalism School and received the 2022 Professional Excellence Award from the Foreign Press Correspondents Association. He was also a Chevening Scholar with the UK's Foreign Office in 2016-17. Mr. Ziabari, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for this introduction, and it's a pleasure to join you and the other distinguished panelists today for this important conversation. I appreciate the opportunity, and I offer my gratitude to the Association for Iranian Studies for structuring this conversation at a time when it could have not been more important or relevant. And I also offer my sympathies and my thoughts, apparently the best we can do at this time, to the people of Iran who have been experiencing a lot of turmoil and anxiety recently with the outbreak of the illegal war on Iran, and before that they had gone through another stretch of difficulty and uncertainty with the nationwide protest that was violently repressed by the Iranian government. In order to join this conversation, I thought of a theoretical framework to situate my ideas as to how to respond to the bombing of Iranian universities and institutions of higher education. And I believe that it's important for us to cover the foundations of what can make such an atrocity possible. And in my perspective, the bombing and target of Iranian universities during the US-Israeli war of aggression was the culmination of years of dehumanization and ostracization of Iran and Iranian institutions as a whole. This long-standing campaign of dehumanization has been carried out very subtly, very professionally and effectively. And regardless of the rationales and motives behind it, the outcome has been that we are faced with a persistent weakening and debilitation of Iran's civil society, the gradual elimination of the agency of Iranians, and the marginalization of the voices of moderation. And by moderation, I do not necessarily mean the moderation in the context of modern Iranian politics, just the voices of reason and rationality, which have been increasingly sidelined and pushed to the peripheries of discourse that is right now being dominated and pretty much hegemonized by voices of extremity and at some point we are saying this is also leading to the domination of the voices of violence. As a result, when different forms of punishment are inflicted on Iranian people, be it sanctions or diplomatic political isolation, or as we've seen recently, this outburst of conflict and war, and I believe this is a pretty much recent trend. One of the first groups to try to offer rationalizations for those actions are sadly Iranians themselves and not the perpetrators of those acts and policies. This is what many scholars, including the independent researcher Denis Zubizarreta, have referred to as the colonial Stockholm syndrome. We've had, sadly, diaspora voices theorizing and offering rationalizations for different atrocities that have been carried out over the past months by the United States and Israel in Iran. As I try to document this ongoing conflict and the different reactions to it, I saw a video of an Iranian immigrant dad who told a reporter while carrying his small child on his shoulders during a pro-war rally that he was happy after the bombing of the elementary school in Mina in southern Iran, which killed more than 150 children and teachers. Initial investigations by the U.S. Department of Defense, Pentagon has attributed the attacks to outdated intelligence and implied U.S. wrongdoing. So I guess the connotations are pretty much clear. When there is an implicit tendency on behalf of the perpetrators to claim responsibility, and we are seeing a situation in which those who have apparently been either directly or indirectly affected by the violence appear to be willing to brush it aside for more complicated underlying reasons that we can try to discuss at some point. It requires a separate forum, I guess. Which I guess means that we do not need to be politically opposed to the agents of injustice in order to be opposed to their malign actions, or at least empathize with the victims and survivors. And when this mindset is cultivated and it's perpetuated, it's much easier to get away with more delicate agendas, such as eroding the sovereignty of a nation by seeking to dismantle its educational institutions. And I guess pretty much everyone is in agreement that whenever institutions of higher education are targeted, it's ultimately the young people and the future change makers of those societies, any society in which education is attacked, who would be paying the price. I mean, students in Iran, as our two panelists, Dr. Banuazizi and Dr. Khanlarzade mentioned, are the ones who have been almost unanimously the critical thinkers, the voices of reason, those who would ultimately end up being the partners for dialogue with the international community, those who would be the scholars, the future professors, the future researchers, journalists, writers, artists, the ones who have been shaping this space of civil activism in Iran. So when the safety and the sanctity of the institutions in which they have been studying, they have been doing research, they have been creating art, they have been challenging their professors, they have been challenging the indirect purveyors of power, including those connected to the establishment, have had a chance to storm talks, for example, by presidents and ministers. When these institutions and their safety are undermined, I'm not sure who is going to benefit. And the ones who are going to pay price are these students. What will be eroded is the civil discourse. Here, terminologies such as collateral damage and dual use come into play to enable ideological goals that would otherwise be deemed entirely unacceptable and outrageous. I mean, more than 30 universities were bombed, and some of them are among the top regional universities ranked by Times Higher Education 2026 within the top 100 Asian universities. For example, Shahid Beheshti University, Sharif University of Technology, Iran University of Science and Technology, and many others that have been less mentioned. And what happens when this rare pattern of state-sanctioned violence becomes acceptable? We have to ask what has created the context in which there is this degree of indifference, that there's little proclivity to prompt investigations, including by media institutions and organizations in countries like Britain, Canada, Australia, and the United States, which have historically thrived over centuries as a result of higher education. And it means that these nations, these institutions, these countries intimately recognize the importance of education and universities. We saw the emergence of the early indications of the pattern of a scholasticide during the 2-year war in Gaza. All 12 universities in Gaza were destroyed, and more than 90% of schools in the coastal enclave were either damaged or entirely demolished. Israeli officials offered a range of explanations as to why these attacks were carried out. And I mean, whenever they felt impelled to offer such explanations, they just produce brief statements saying that this school or this college was attacked for this specific reason. But with a wider spectrum of prestigious world-class universities that were bombed in Iran, we are yet to see official statements on each single institution that was struck, more than 30 universities, and in most cases, simply because there has not been any questioning, any line of investigation, they haven't felt compelled to even answer, even express regrets or apologies. For example, I mean, on a couple of occasions, the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, said that the Malek Ashtar University in Tehran and the Imam Hussein University were bombed because they were academic training institutions. And that's their logic. And the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions attribute the responsibility to define proportionality to the perpetrators of the attacks, which means that if they believe that these institutions would be considered legitimate military targets, then they are the ones who have to make a determination. And ultimately, whoever carries out an attack would be arguing that they had a legitimate reason to carry out those attacks. But we don't know, however, for example, why the Isfahan University of Art or Tehran University of Art or the Persian Gulf University in Bushehr were bombed. I mean, in the case of Persian Gulf University, for example, the student accommodation, which was a student dorm used by 600 students, was demolished. And even if we are ever given the full accounts and a comprehensive justification, I guess the targeting of academic institutions crosses boundaries that had long been in place to ensure that war crimes wouldn't be commissioned so frequently and wouldn't be treated as so commonplace and accepted. And I guess, I mean, the next step, if this pattern becomes routinized and formalized, would be to see foreign language departments of public universities in Iran being targeted after being reassigned and classified as legitimate military targets by belligerents, simply because someone in the military in Israel might argue that these students will be learning to communicate anti-war ideas in other languages like Arabic or I don't know. When the former White House political director and chairman of the American Conservative Union, Matt Schlapp, said in an interview on the Piers Morgan show that the Minab schoolgirls would have been living behind burqas in a barbaric society if they were alive, and everyone tried to keep this horrendous statement under wraps. I guess it becomes unmistakably clear that the distinctions over which many of us, many Iranians, Iranian Americans, those in the diaspora have been arguing and clashing over years in a bid to separate the government, the regime, clerics, society, people, country, do not materially make a difference to the most hardline decision makers who theorize these kind of attacks. And this is what I believe would explain the broader ideological and civilizational goals which have made the targeting of Iranian universities an acceptable side effect or even an acceptable element, the central element of this war. On Saturday, March 7, US President Donald Trump said aboard Air Force One that in response to and that's what he actually said in response to a question by a reporter on the destruction of the desalination plant in Desh Island, that they are among the most evil people ever on earth. They cut babies' heads off and they chop women in half. So together with the earlier statement, which I read out, that these kids are apparently better off dead because otherwise they would have to live under burqas. These statements clearly signify a sheer lack of an awareness of Iran as a society, the modern state of life in Iran, lifestyle, the culture, and the people characterizes Iran as part of the Middle East, which has always been treated as apparently this just hotbed of resources which need to be extracted without regard for civilian life, without regard for the distinctions of the people, without regard for their individual characteristics and their identities. So, and I guess when we hear statements of this nature, it would be reasonable to conclude, or at least infer, that these politicians do not even bother to try to study or investigate, or at least familiarize themselves with the realities of these regions. I mean, they do not clearly, in Trump's case at least, do not recognize which country they are talking about simply because they have not engaged with that community. They have still, I mean, got some vague ideas of what region of the world they're talking about, but when they said that, um, I mean, burqas are not practiced in Iran. I'm not sure what he meant by saying that they are chopping babies into halves. So they are clearly rehashing civilizational stereotypes that have been perpetuated over years without being challenged properly. And us as scholars and reporters and journalists, I guess, are part of this um, um, problem. I should acknowledge, at least my part, because we have also absorbed some of these talking points and rehashed them in other ways. And I would ask, why should even why a politician like the US president at this time should try to even draw a distinction between the Iranian government and the Iranian people? If he believes that such a distinction exists, why doesn't he clearly articulate it? If it doesn't, which is obviously the case because he threatened elsewhere in April 8th through social post that he intended to wipe out an entire civilization, why should we, as the scholars and journalists and the stakeholders of the debate, be the ones to absorb these unacceptable forms of thinking and rhetoric and try to peddle it and explain it away, and to try to perpetuate this discourse, which has long led to not just the dehumanization of Iranian people, but the entire region. Which is to say, the obliteration of Iranian universities is much easier if we are going to go along that path, and much more uncomplicated when this mentality is clearly not one built around discourse of mutual recognition or understanding or respect for the Iranian people. More than 200 complaints have been filed with US-based Military Religious Freedom Foundation by service members across different branches of armed forces, saying that they have been instructed by this administration in the US, by the Trump administration, that the war on Iran is a divine mission, which is aimed at bringing about the Armageddon. So, I mean, elsewhere we have heard, for example, from Senator Lindsey Graham, that he believes this is a war, a conflict that is meant to change the religious composition of the Middle East for the next 1,000 years. So put together, I believe that what we've been seeing has been an ambitious project. Part of it has been actually manifesting itself in at least a lack of due diligence for the sanctity and sovereignty of Iranian universities. This ideological project would apparently be treading along the paths of reconfiguring the political and ideological makeup of the Middle East and Iran as well. None of this is to say that without bombing by US and Israel, universities in Iran would be in a state of absolute freedom, or that they would be permitted to do research as they should, to function according to their mandate. But this is exactly, as we have been talking, a further weakening of these institutions. I guess we can further, excuse me, try to elaborate on that. But at this time, we'll just conclude.
Thank you. Mr. Ziabari, and everyone. So we have a little bit of time, 15 minutes or so for a conversation. And I can go ahead and start asking one question from each one of you, and then we can see if you have questions from each other. So my first question is for Dr. Banuazizi. You refer to the students' long history of opposition from 16 Azar to post-1979 Cultural Revolution protests. In your view, what is genuinely new about the current moment and what feels like a repetition of past patterns?
Uh, well, in terms of the contents of the opposition, it really hasn't changed very much. There is, of course, an element in the more recent weeks of recognizing the aggression by the Israeli and American forces and the bombings and so on, and that part is new. Uh, but but in many other ways, I think the opposition of the students to any kind of repressive policy or limitations on the fundamental freedoms of student life, of academic life, they've remained the same. But a couple of other points to keep in mind. The number of students in Iranian universities is truly remarkable if you think about how we have gone from, let's say, 150,000 to, if I'm not wrong, over 4 million students in Iran today. By the way, 65% of the students are women, which is also unusual and very important. So that aspect, I think, is very important. You know, we are now talking not about a handful of universities in Iran, but scores of universities, many of which were mentioned in the previous presentations. That's one element. The other element, however, is the sense of desperation that the young people in Iran feel, not only with regards to their educational institutions, but about life in general. I recently read a piece by an Iranian economist, Masoud Nili, in which one figure really caught my attention, that there are 12 million young Iranians today who are neither in educational institutions, nor do they have a job, nor do they have the prospect of getting a job. So you can feel the sense of desperation among the young people. Part of it, of course, is reflected in the positions or reactions of the university students as well. Okay. So again, it's really important to keep in mind that we are dealing with a context in Iran today that, aside from the attacks from the outside, is really a desperate situation for young people. And we obviously need to show as much sympathy and involvement with these issues as we possibly can, given the state of affairs. It's really not only unprecedented, but I don't know of any other society at this time in which you have such a large number of young people eager, to pursue education and careers and so on, and are totally frustrated by all the factors that we all recognize and know about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khanlarzade and Mr. Ziabari. Do you have any comments about this question? I can move to your questions as well. Okay, so for Dr. Khanlarzade, I was very interested in this idea of dispossession you mentioned from the previous, critiques, Iranian critiques of science, militarism, and securitization and capitalism. So, how might this reconnecting with this intellectual tradition actually change the way current students and faculty respond to today's bombings and sanctions?
Thank you so much. This is a very, very good question and very complex. So I think that if you, in the slide that I was discussing this point, I don't know if you noticed, but there is a screenshot of the first page of a letter that Ahmad Kasravi wrote to European and American scientists. نامه به دانشمندان اروپایی و آمریکایی. So just imagine that in 1941, he's writing a letter and he's talking at in a very universal global setting, that he's imagining his own role there to discuss ethical science. And how can we delink science from militarism? How can we, and there are also questions with regards to capitalism under the influence of war, not general capitalism, but capitalism at the time of war, that he's asking these questions. And he wants to create a collective of to think about such questions with relation with science, science and war and so on. The same we have with the 1960s, that a text written by Al Ahmad that has been critiqued so much, and it's been but then at the same time there are aspects of this text, for instance his text, that he's critiquing hydrogen bomb and the possibility of the connection between violence, militarism, and technology. And also the ideal he has is this technologically advanced society, that is, technology is at the service of some type of socialism. And of course, also the technology being untied from militarism and violence. And then when it comes to 70s, we have Shariati, who was talking about the integration of science and humanities. And he thinks that they should actually work together, in the sense that we need to ask, what is the role of science in the society? And or certain question about social justice. Now we can critique this, obviously, and they have been critiqued, but such questions existed, such critiques existed. And in my research on Sharif University, I noticed that they had not entered the campuses. And Sharif obviously was a college, and it was STEM. And so we already had such shortcomings, and partly because science is imagined to be universal, and some of these critics just did not really enter the campuses. But what we see in the post-revolution, there is a video of the father of one of the protesters who were killed. And the father is saying that we have reached faqr mutlaq, we have reached the absolute dispossession, absolute poverty. به اسلامتان شک کردیم, which means that we no longer trust your Islam. And he's talking to the government, he's talking to the state, and he's telling the government that you have pushed us to the absolute poverty. So this absolute poverty is the contamination of political thought, contamination of certain languages related to social justice. For instance, like using the word imperialism in Farsi is very loaded, is very charged because of the way that Islamic Republic has dealt with it. Or many other aspects, like for instance, the same as the critiques of, for instance, Gharb Zadegi, or the critiques of, many of these thinkers, wrongfully, they have been seen and interpreted as the ancestors, intellectual ancestors to Islamic Republic, which is not actually, that lineage is not correct. But other than that, they're also not precise. But there is this trauma, like somebody dealing with trauma, and the way that they are reacting to certain critiques and certain languages. And a part of the reason for the popularity of monarchism and its this absolute poverty. It's the way that we are no longer connected to this tradition, intellectual traditions that we're questioning and challenging and critiquing. So, for instance, the nuclear activities, the nuclear policies, they are not critiqued as much as they should be critiqued. And the relationship between science and politics and society, politics and government policies and foreign policy, that has also not been as critiqued as we would wish them to be, as strongly critiqued. So there are these concerns, and a part of it comes with the absolute dispossession, and part of it is because of the resonances with Islamic Republic, or thinking that these are intellectual. There are some common surfaces or resonances, and there's also the repression. The repression is also part of it, because universities do not really have the space to think and organize. And I was reading actually an essay on how Milli Mazhabis, national religious groups, not reformists, they were actually criminalized after the revolution, and they could not work and do activism freely. It's been very hard for them to also organize and so on. So these are all interconnected. And yeah, so I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I think that's, yeah, so that the second part of your question. So I think if we had the chance to be engaged with our past, our intellectual history, and be critical of those, and also think about, these were the questions that existed, for instance, in the 60s, in the 70s. So how do we understand those questions? What was the ideal they were imagining in those moments, and whether they were critical of what exactly? And how we imagine those ideals at this current moment, and how we are critical of those ideals they imagined in the 70s, and what do we think also about what they were critical of, and how are we going to engage with those thoughts and come up with new questions and come up with new answers, not necessarily answers even, like come up with new questions and engage with their questions. We almost have lost that because we have already dismissed this critical intellectual history as nativism, anti-modern, or simply intellectual lineage of Islamic Republic.
Thank you. Anyone wants to comment? Okay, Mr. Ziabari, I want to ask something about your own specific expertise as a journalist who's based outside of Iran, but writing about Iran. How do you navigate this ethical tension between critiquing the Iranian state and avoiding narratives that can be weaponized to justify more aggression and punishment of ordinary Iranians by sanctions and war?
That's a very important question, and I guess especially at this time, my responsibility I've been feeling has been much more complicated, because currently I'm almost entirely focused on covering the conflict and the different ways in which the war has been affecting Iranian civilians, and the staggering civilian toll of the conflict, which has been neglected mostly in the corporate media coverage of Iran. But this doesn't mean that my coverage is limited to only this aspect, and it actually complements a long history of my reporting on Iran and its different dimensions as a society, as a country, in which we have a history of course, post 1979 political turmoil and uprisings, and frequent clashes between a theocracy that has been demonstrably intransigent and inflexible, and a civil society that has been trying to reassert itself and make a stride toward new milestones. And at the same time, the civil society, which has much to offer, but is continuously ignored in the coverage, in the media reporting on Iran. And this is one of my, serious questions for my colleagues in the mainstream media. Why is any reference to Iranian arts and culture so difficult to be made in our reporting? I personally pitched a story shortly before the anniversary of the passing of Iranian mathematician and first female field medal recipient, Maryam Mirzakhani, to actually detail a profile of her life and also to um, make an argument as to why Iran lost the treasure because of its own self-deprecating policies in retaining talent and in retaining its best minds. Um, and that, say, as I pitched it and as I tried to outline, would kind of shed a positive light on the accomplishments and achievements of Iranian scientists and scholars who have made huge contributions to American society and the West as a whole. That story was rejected, that the story idea was rejected by more than 10 editors. I never understood why. I never understood what was harmful or unacceptable in that pitch that couldn't be taken by any publication. So these are questions that I struggle with as I go by, but of course, the coverage of Iran has never been easy. And what I tell myself is that I should simply focus on telling the story as truthfully as possible, as truthfully as I can, and based on the principles that have been taught, that I'm not at the mercy of anyone, any institution, any government, any politician to tell me or dictate to me that this is the line of thinking that it should be spreading or promoting, which means that independence also comes with sometimes personal hardships. But I've been enjoying this independence because there's no single story or no single essay, opinion piece, or report I've penned over more than 17 years of doing journalism in which I have written something that was dictated to me or something that I didn't believe in. I may have written something 10 years ago in which I had a slightly different perspective. I have probably echoed something that has kind of underwent a transformation. So if I look back at that piece I wrote in 2009 or 2008, I may have a different interpretation of that. But that's something that at that time I believed in sincerely and firmly. And that was not the result of anyone telling me that that's what you're supposed to write. Um, that's something that sadly journalists and academics, especially working on Iran as a discipline, as a field, deal with at all times, that they sometimes find it difficult to strike a balance and sometimes difficult to respond to the demands of different groups of audience and different demographics who sometimes challenge us by requesting further sincerity or further clarity. But what I can say is that I believe that Iran, in all of its complexity, requires scrutiny and study and investigation. Of course, there are stories that I tell and recount with more dedication and more attention, just because that story personally appeals to me more. That doesn't mean that I have or I can simply condone or ignore other threats or other themes. Um, I mean, if I look at my portfolio of journalism, up until the war broke out, 85, I haven't quantified it precisely, but I can say 90% of my writings were critical of the Iranian government. Um, Even though I shouldn't be kind of identifying myself as a dissident or a critic, as a journalist, I'm supposed to kind of adhere to a specific degree of objectivity. But when a war breaks out and that actually is demolishing the civilian infrastructure of a nation, in which civilians are being killed in dozens, in huge numbers, in which the rhetoric is entirely dehumanizing, in which the global audience is actually withheld certain perspectives and is denied the opportunity to hear from Iranians underground who are suffering as a result of this war. I guess there is a degree of moral clarity that I should demonstrate by trying to also highlight those voices that are missing. It's difficult to do journalism in these times, but I'm doing my best.
Thank you, Mr. Ziabari. Yes, Dr. Banuazizi.
I just wanted to add one event that we are all very much aware of, and that is the shutting down of the internet in Iran. The impact of that on businesses, on women, on students, on academic institutions. You know, internet is not, as you well know, something that is by any stretch of imagination a sideline in the lives of people. It is the very core of their awareness, of their connectedness, of their business, of their pursuit of knowledge, of their awareness of world events. And I think the impact of the closure of the internet, and more recently, the many ways in which the regime is trying to use various approaches by selling, access to the internet for some people. That's a remarkably important event, and I think we should all be aware of it and critical of it as much as any other pressure that our country is facing today.
Thank you so much. That's actually a great segue into my next question, which was for all of you. And I had in mind, the internet and help with that. My question is, all of you in different ways mentioned centering Iranian students, as, whether they were protesters or whether they are victims of these bombings, as future scholars, the future generation of the intellectual life and knowledge production in Iran. What forms of support do you think we should prioritize? Dr. Banuazizi just mentioned internet, which is absolutely important. What are other ways that these affected students can be supported? And perhaps this can be our final note to wrap up the conversation. That yes, we have faced the protests and we have faced the bombing. Now as people who are intellectuals who are in international academia, as our responsibility, how should we prioritize Iranian students and help them and support them? What ways can you imagine? Internet is one, of course. If we could provide VPNs and, internet inside the country, of course.
Well, I'll be very brief. It seems to me that one important way would be for all of us to do all that we can to reflect the views of Iranian students and intellectuals and so on, wherever we are, in teaching, in conversations, in articles, and so on. The many books, shifting now a little bit from the students to intellectuals, there are many books, many groups, many attempts in Iran to analyze the situation, to analyze the Iranian economy, polity, society, and so on. And as much as we can, I think we should try to introduce, to promote, and to give weight to those voices. That's a responsibility, I think, that we must take on.
I will add just a few points that were just beautifully made. And I think, yes, of course, the internet is very important. And I was just thinking, like yesterday, it just came to my mind. I was just thinking, if somebody is writing a thesis, how can they do that? It's just, if they are just writing anything, how can they do that without internet? It would be impossible. So I think one thing we need to do is to listen to students and listen to them. Because oftentimes in the critiques we offer, in the analysis we offer, especially throughout the last year or so, we have dismissed Iranians' views as false consciousness, as manipulated by Israel, manipulated by US, manipulated by Iran International. And this is not really listening. This is judging. So we should make a distinction between judging and between listening and trying to understand and trying to learn. And listening should be on equal footing. Like we can't really judge someone as false consciousness if we are really listening to the stories that they are telling us. And this does not mean that we don't have the right to be critical. Obviously, we're going to be critical. There was just recently a protest, I think in UK, by some Iranians who were wearing, on their T-shirts, they had the Sabak, for instance. Of course, we're going to be critical, and these are not the students, obviously, but in general, I'm just saying that we can be critical, but then the listening, we need to also think about what does it mean to listen, because listening is not just having a little bit of some ideas of what's happening and then immediately going back to dismiss it or dismiss it as false consciousness or manipulation or desperation. So we need to think about what it means to listen. The other thing is to work with the students, to work not just the students, but I think was also mentioned that in these panels, Dr. Banuazizi mentioned that we need to work and collaborate with scholars and students in Iran. Now, again, I don't have an answer for this. Like, how can this actually work? And so what are the limitations and what are the obstacles? How can we overcome this and really work with them? Even if you cannot work with them, and if it's hard, and if there might be ways to, create a collective for research. And this can also be very beneficial to researchers outside of Iran because there are limitations. You don't have access to certain resources, the archival material and so on. But it can be, there might be a way to not extract and not to exploit, but equally, both parties equally work together. The other thing is the citation of Persian written material. It's important. I know that it's very hard, and oftentimes we need to, translate and so on. But engaging with material and the intellectual production of scholars and students in Iran, that's also very important. And the other thing is also collaboration with human rights activists, with journalists, and I think that is also like many students activists who leave Iran and immigrate to European or North America. They work as human rights activists. They work as general political activists and journalists and so on. And I feel like the scholarship is very separated from the work they do. And that has been more harmful to the scholarship than it has been harmful to their work. But I think both parties will benefit so much from collaborating and talking to each other and knowing what each one of these groups their concerns are. The other thing that I noticed during Women Life Freedom movement, I had a major issue with the fact that there were women's rights activists who had been working for years and years on women's rights issues, but because they were more comfortable speaking Persian than English, for instance, or some of them, they spoke other European languages, but not just English, we did not hear their voice. Their voice were not really included on the panels. So it's important to organize panels that are bilingual, or find ways to have a panel in Persian, but then maybe somehow translated or, subtitles or written material. But that language is also a barrier, and we need to also think about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Khanlarzade. Just a note that I'm very proud that the Journal of Iranian Studies under the leadership of Dr. Rahimieh has begun already working with Iranian, university students and helping them with mentorship and publication. And I personally have been a mentor for a student. So we are on our way to helping, and hopefully we can do more than just the journal publication. Thank you. Dr. Ziabari, any comments?
Thank you. Just to clarify, I'm not a doctor yet. But on the question of how to offer support to Iranian students and Iranian scholars as a whole, I guess there are a number of bullet points that I can try to reference in summary. First and foremost, in response to the latest wave of violence and attacks against Iranian universities by the US and Israel during the war, I believe the recognition of what happened is important. And I guess the relative silence of the international academic community and their failure or refusal to stand up for their peers and colleagues in Iran has been a problematic pattern that needs to be corrected. For example, I mean, the most famous example, Sharif University of Technology, which at least Iranians have been talking about a lot. This is a university that is being referred to as Iran's MIT. We cannot imagine that under any circumstances, the targeting or airstrike against a university of that prestige and standing in any other country would be treated so flippantly, I should say. So I guess to just stand up and to say that this needs to end here, and this pattern, even if it existed so far, should be corrected and should be denounced and should be investigated. And there should be reparations, and there should be a mechanism for Iranian academic institutions that have been targeted during the war to be able to receive compensation and war compensations, as we've seen in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that there have been frameworks along those lines. Of course, the Iranian students in the US, for example, as we are talking from US-centric perspective, have been among the most dynamic and creative and industrious populations of international students in the country. They're currently facing a range of restrictions and challenges, mostly the immigration restrictions that have been imposed by this current administration in the US. I mean, when Donald Trump came to power, he first started by pausing immigration from Iran and then expanded the travel ban to include Iranian students, then to pause immigration benefits processing from applicants inside the US. And now there are unofficial instructions to universities to try to limit their intake. In some examples, there have been reports of universities receiving instructions unofficially that they should limit the intake of students of Iranian origin. So these are the questions that we have to ponder, and how are we going to remedy these practices and structures that are clearly discriminatory against Iranian students. And at the same time, I believe for so long we've had the de facto sanctions regime, not just against Iran or the Iranian government, but also against Iranian academic institutions. We do not see for example, traditional academic exchange that used to happen from time to time sporadically between Iranian and American universities. There have been delegations sent to Iran by, for example, international education initiatives funded by the US State Department. Of course, it doesn't happen today, and we do not expect it to happen anytime soon, but there have been some lifelines that were offered to Iranian institutions to maintain some sort of connection. And whenever we have seen these extensions of lifelines, we have also seen the concomitant thriving of civil discourse change and transformation in Iran as well, to isolate and segregate the country from the rest of the world, especially a country in which a huge population is under 30 and a large population is university students, mostly female. I guess deliberately isolating it and divesting it from it would be counterproductive, and the result would be just a further cementing and deepening of conservative and reactionary thought. Also, I believe that there should be some clarity as to what universities in the US can do to engage with not just Iranian institutions inside Iran, but Iranian scholars and academics here in the US. I have been just surveying in the lead up to this panel some websites of US-based institutions, academic institutions, some major public universities in which they have dedicated pages detailing the sort of restrictions that their faculty members should be mindful of as they conduct business or correspondence even with Iranian individuals, any Iranian entity. That's alarming because we are somewhat institutionalizing and formalizing restrictions against an academic community based on their national origin. I'm not sure why this should be acceptable, why we should be concerned that a US professor here should be persistently cautious as to what kind of communication and correspondence they can have with their partners in Iran. And finally, I believe that excuse me, it's important that we think of frameworks through which we can offer further financial support to Iranian students and applicants of higher education. Maybe in the next 2.5 years, it wouldn't be possible in the US because there's no legal pathway for Iranian students to come to the US. But in European countries or elsewhere in Canada or Australia or other nations, which are major competitors in higher education, Iranians in this economic landscape, with the steep devaluation of the national currency and hyperinflation, do not have any plausible pathway of being able to fund and subsidize their studies without scholarships, without mostly full scholarships. If we espouse and claim to be supportive of Iranian people, that's one of the simple ways in which we can offer them support.
Thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Banuazizi.
Just to add one point, when we think about Iran's relationship to the outside world, as you just mentioned, we should include the European countries and Australia and India and so on. I want to give one example of that. There is an institution in Holland called Iran Academia. And each year they take in between 125 to 150 students in their master's program, many of whom are Iranian students who are, this is all through the internet, of course, who are registering in this master's program. They have completed this master's program, and the program has been recognized by the European community so that they can then move on to PhD programs in Europe or possibly even later on in the United States. So this is the kind of connection which I think is important to promote, to expand, if not in the United States, then in European countries. I mean, think about it, 100 to 150 students registering for master's degree, completing it, and then getting prepared to move on. And finally, let's not forget that among our young people, without any exaggeration, we have some of the most sophisticated young people, compared to any other society. It's extremely different from my generation. And, we thought that we were intellectuals too, but there's really no comparison between the young people in Iran today and the young people in Iran 2 or 3 generations ago. They're far more connected to the world, much more aware of the issues that we were talking about, and I think willing to, to take risks. So that also is a positive thing to bear in mind.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the reminder about Iran academia. Yes, I can say that I have served on several master's theses for these students, and I can attest that they are brilliant. Um, any final comments, questions? We are well over 90 minutes. We're getting closer to 2 hours at this time, and I'm very grateful for your time and expertise and the knowledge you shared. But any final comments before we close? Well, thank you so much for sharing your time, knowledge, experience in this space with me and with our membership. And I really hope that our membership will benefit from this conversation, and these conversations can continue in other formats with all of us, with the other members of our association. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Many, many thanks.
Thank you very much.